Point of order, Douglas Ross.
I'm grateful, Presiding Officer. I'm seeking a ruling from you under Standing Order 17.2.1a to suspend Standing Order 13.8.1. Standing Order 13.8.1 relates to the lodging of urgent questions, which states they must be lodged by 10 a.m. on the day they are to be taken. If we can agree to suspend standing orders to vary the time, and the time only of Standing Order 13.8.1, I can resubmit my urgent question to you for you to consider whether ministers should be brought to Parliament today to speak about the written case that has now been presented in the judicial review between the Scottish Government and For Women Scotland on the transgender prisoner policy with SPS. You rightly said last week during First Minister's questions that Parliament shouldn't be a library, and I agree with that. I also agree that Parliament should be a Parliament. And surely on an issue of importance such as this, where there were cross-party questions to the Government, we should act as a Parliament and hear from ministers on the same day that this information is made public. And I also note that in response to me last week asking a question on this topic, the First Minister said this: "The Government is trying to make information available to ensure that members of the public can follow the case in a well-informed way." Well, we will be able to follow the case in a well-informed way by questioning ministers. This came out in a government press release, as I said to the Minister for Parliamentary Business, at 9:46 a.m. There was no government-initiated question when they could have alerted every MSP about this. There was, to the best of my knowledge, no offer from the Government to make a statement from a minister. Therefore, our only recourse as opposition parties and backbench MSPs is through an urgent question. And I fully accept that when I lodged my urgent question, it was beyond the time, but I think there are compelling reasons for this issue to be debated today in this Parliament with ministers answering questions. Therefore, I move or seek your guidance on how I can move a motion to suspend Standing Order 17.2.1a to allow a suspension of Standing Order 13.8.1 to allow this urgent question to be considered today. Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Ross, and I appreciate advance notice of your intention to raise this matter. I am not minded today to accept a motion without notice. I think it is obviously very clear to Parliament the determination with which I ensure that all members have an opportunity to scrutinise the Government fully and regularly, whether that be through urgent question or selection of other questions. And I would just remind Mr Ross of the other opportunities that do exist and are available to him this week. We will now move on to our next item of business. That's consideration of business motion 20486 in the name of Graham Day, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a timetable for the Stage 3 consideration of the Tertiary Education and Training Funding and Governance Scotland Bill. And I ask any member who wishes to speak to the motion to press their request to speak button. And I call on Graham Day to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 20486 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is Stage 3 proceedings for Tertiary Education and Training Funding and Governance Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, that is Scottish Parliament Bill 57A, the marshalled list and the groupings of amendments. The division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for around 5 minutes if there is a division, and the period of voting for the division will be 30 seconds. Members who wish to speak in the debate on the amendment, please press your request to speak buttons or enter RTS in the chat as soon as an amendment is called. Members should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. So, we move to Group 1, National Funding Strategy. I call Amendment 10 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendment 74. Minister to move Amendment 10 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I am grateful to you and all the Parliament staff and all MSP colleagues for their engagement on this bill. And I am pleased to open this afternoon's debate on the Stage 3 amendments, particularly with an amendment which I hope a lot of members in this chamber will welcome and be interested in. This amendment also gives effect to the commitment I gave at stage 2 to consider further what, if anything, the Government could do to bring forward in response to Pam Duncan-Glancy's Amendments 38 and 39. My Amendment 10 would require the Scottish Ministers to create and maintain a national funding strategy for tertiary education, skills and apprenticeships in Scotland. This strategy would establish a foundation for our tertiary education and skills system and would ensure that funding decisions are based on an even more robust understanding of the skills needs in Scotland, not only at national level, but also across Scotland's diverse local and regional contexts, which I know a number of members are interested in, and quite rightly, as is the Government. Under this amendment, the national funding strategy would have to explain Scotland's skills needs, set out the Scottish Minister's priorities for funding for further and higher education, national training programmes, apprenticeships and work-based learning. Additionally, it would set out the outcomes that the Scottish Ministers intend to achieve through that investment. For clarity, for universities, it would not direct funding towards provision specifically, as universities are autonomous bodies. I believe that this amendment would overall create a coherent, strategic direction for Scotland that is better aligned with the skills needs that we have. Scottish Ministers would be required to publish and update the strategy and lay it before Parliament, of course, publishing ministerial priorities and intended outcomes which would aid transparency and ensure that Parliament, stakeholders and the public can rightly scrutinise the policy direction of government on skills and the progress it achieves. The requirement to report regularly would, of course, enforce that. Crucially, the preparation and revision of this strategy would be informed by meaningful consultation with a wide range of relevant stakeholders, including employers, trade unions, and the bodies delivering the education and skills training. The amendment does not set out an exhaustive list. For example, it would be important and my intention that organisations and groups representing students and apprentices and those with disabilities were consulted so that their important and specific needs are provided for in any funding strategy. By ensuring that this strategy is rooted in evidence and shaped through collaboration and engagement and with clearly specified outcomes, this amendment would strengthen the Government's approach and therefore the nation's approach to skills planning and to the funding of the tertiary education and skills system. Again, an important outcome which we would want to track and report on would be improving access to education and training opportunities for people with disabilities and other disadvantaged groups. And I know that is of particular interest to my colleague Jeremy Balfour. Yes.
Miles Briggs.
We're supportive of this amendment, but I wanted to ask the Minister whether or not it is the Scottish Government's vision that they will make colleges lead delivery providers for modern apprenticeships as part of this bill, with a minimum percentage, which isn't in the amendment, but obviously a minimum percentage of apprenticeships delivered through colleges as part of that college first principle, which I tried to progress at stage 2.
Minister.
So the importance of colleges in the delivery, as Mr Briggs rightly emphasises, it should not be underestimated. We do want our colleges to lead, but also we have, of course, important roles are occupied in the current system by training providers, and we want to enhance the system overall. But yes, of course, the role of colleges in the delivery of our apprenticeship system will, of course, continue to progress and become more and more important in the years ahead. Overall, I hope that members will support this Amendment 10, particularly given points that have been made through the process of Stage 2. Yes, I'd be happy to give way to Willie Rennie.
Willie Rennie.
The Minister will know that University of Scotland have expressed concern about this strategy. They feel it risks encroaching on the ONS classification and into their already independent status. And that's obviously been a sensitive issue, particularly around about the University of Dundee and the use of Section 25. So what can he say to University of Scotland to give them assurance that that is not what the Minister and Government intends in this regard?
Minister.
I thank Willie Rennie for raising that important point and for the engagement that I've had with him on this matter and also with University of Scotland in advance of these Stage 3 proceedings. I would refer back to the point I made just a moment ago where I sought to emphasise for clarity that for universities the strategy would not direct funding towards provision specifically because universities are autonomous bodies. And in preparing the report, the Government would be meticulously careful about making sure that we set out what the strategy would mean for universities very, very carefully and very, very specifically, in order to make sure that there was no encroachment on the autonomy of universities and the protection of their existing status was preserved. And I will take an amendment from Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you to the Minister for taking the intervention. Can I ask if the Minister is in a position to set out when the Government will publish the responses to the consultation that it recently carried out on support for part-time study and disabled students, consultation that closed on the 9th of October? Minister.
I thank Pam Duncan-Glancy for raising those points and highlighting this important consultation. If she would be so kind, I will take that away as an action and an update both her and Parliament more widely on the progress of the findings of that important consultation and when publication will happen and Parliament will be able to see and the public more widely will be able to see the outcomes. If I may move on, so just to conclude, as I said, I hope that members will support Amendment 10, particularly given some of what was said at stage 2 around making sure that we take a strategic approach collectively and that we consider the short, medium and long-term interests of the economy and the skills that we're going to require, because Amendment 10 would further ensure that decisions about funding of Scotland's tertiary education skills system in the future are shaped by evidence, informed by stakeholders and are responsive to the needs of learners, employers and communities across Scotland. Finally, Amendment 74 makes a consequential change to the Bill's long title to add reference to the strategy there, and therefore I would encourage support for that too, and I move Amendment 10 and urge members to support my amendments in Group 1.
Thank you. I call Daniel Johnson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I actually begin by thanking the Minister for his very constructive engagement, I think particularly around this issue. And I think we had a number of interesting conversations about the critical nature of strategy. But what I would want to emphasise at this point is, while I welcome this amendment and we will be supporting it, I think there is an issue that it's necessary to hold. And indeed, I think it is interesting that people have so many questions, because the fundamental issue with this bill is, as of now, no such strategy exists. And the problem with the approach of this bill is that without that strategy, we cannot be clear whether this structure is right. Having structure before you are clear about strategy is always going to be problematic. And so while I am grateful for this amendment, and I appreciate the fact that it was, or a version of it was offered as a handout amendment, we couldn't take that because actually this is the inherent flaw with the government's approach. Just as the Minister winds up, I just would ask him to acknowledge the fact that we are 10 years on from the skills review, and actually at the heart of that, the issues that Audit Scotland found was a lack of strategic direction and a lack of clarity about how the systems work together. I'm very happy to take an intervention.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for Daniel Johnson to take the intervention, and I apologise for not being unable to intervene on the Minister. Is not what we're being confronted with today that we're designing an answer before we even know what the question is?
Daniel Johnson.
Well, indeed, I believe that the member has provided me with an answer. That is exactly the issue that we have. This may be the right solution. This may be the structural reform, but we don't know, because we do not understand what the government's vision or intent is, how it will deal with things like flexibility, upskilling, reskilling, digital passports, regionalisation, many of the strategic aspects identified by Withers, highlighted by the many reports. And yes, this strategy will help, but fundamentally, I do believe it exposes the fundamental flaw in the government's approach. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on the Minister to wind up.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to members for their contributions. Just by way of response to what has just been said, I would emphasise that the strategic work that will be taken forward through this Amendment 10 and together with Amendment 74 has already been happening within the Scottish Government, and there will be more to say in that in the months ahead. And of course, the commissioning of the Withers report was part of building that strategic approach, and what we are doing today in this legislation that's before Parliament is seeking to advance much of what the Withers report advocated for, and particularly with regard to the funding position of moving funding for apprenticeships into the Scottish Funding Council and also putting apprenticeships on a statutory footing. So I don't think it's fair to say that there hasn't been a strategic approach and there hasn't been a position taken in order to make sure that we're responding to both consultation and undertaking that consultation and taking an approach that is evidence-led. But I really appreciate the engagement from the member on it. I have sought through the deliberations between stage 2 and today to listen to colleagues and to try and come together around a position that helps us as a nation to move forward. And I'm glad to hear that there is support for this amendment, and I look forward to, if Parliament passes the bill, to that strategy being an important document and an important aspect of government and for business in order to make sure that we can progress together in the right way.
Thank you. And the question is that Amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. We move to Group 2, General Duty of the Scottish Ministers, and I call Amendment 75 in the name of Miles Briggs, grouped with Amendment 11. Miles Briggs to move Amendment 75 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I start from the outset by thanking the Parliament's legislative team for their support. I think they could also do with some more apprentices, to be quite honest, given the amount of legislation going through Parliament, but also to pay tribute and thank our stakeholders as well, who have provided a lot of support during the passage of the bill to get to stage 3. And throughout the passage of this bill, Scottish Conservatives have worked to try to strengthen and embed the voice of industry in the development of Scotland's skills strategy and the development and qualifications for apprenticeships as well. My Amendment 75, therefore, maintains an independent industry-led board to lead the oversight of the design, development, approval and delivery processes for Scottish apprenticeships. I think that's important and something we try to safeguard and progress at stage 2. Now, I welcome Willie Rennie's amendment later on in the bill to create a subcommittee of the Apprenticeship Committee, but alongside many industry leaders, I continue to have concerns that the bill as it stands and the changes it will bring to the apprenticeship delivery environments in Scotland could see industry and their industry voice in developing apprenticeships lost in translation. Because the OECD report advocates for a statutory framework for employer involvement in apprenticeships, citing a range of international best practices in this regard. The 2024 OECD report specifically recommends establishing that statutory framework for employers to retain authority to oversee apprenticeship delivery, develop and approve frameworks, and for that to be legally consulted on when commissioning decisions. I believe in Scotland we should have that maintained. I also welcome the amendment brought forward by my colleague Stephen Kerr in this group, and I move Amendment 75 in my name.
Thank you. And I call Stephen Kerr to speak to Amendment 11 and the other amendment in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think the Minister is to be commended in getting this far with this bill, stage 3, because, frankly, I think he inherited a guddle and he's having to work his way. Trying to make something worthwhile out of this is very difficult, as Miles Briggs has alluded to this afternoon and on other occasions. The Amendment 11 that I'm bringing forward is very basic, but it's a basic thing that's all too often missing from how government approaches education and skills policy in Scotland, and that basic thing is outcomes. Amendment 11 simply requires ministers, when exercising their functions under the Act of regard to what public expenditure is actually achieving. Now, wouldn't that be a breakthrough moment? And to ensure that funding supports measurable improvements in skills, productivity and learner achievement, not intentions, not strategies, not process, but actual outcomes. And that matters, because Scotland already spends very substantial sums across further education, higher education, apprenticeships and national training programmes. What employers repeatedly tell us, however, is that that spend and impact are drifting apart. Productivity growth in Scotland has lagged the UK average for more than a decade. Skills shortages remain acute in engineering, construction, digital, life sciences and advanced manufacturing. And too many young people still struggle to see a clear, credible route from education into sustained employment. The bill as it stands talks a great deal about duties, structures and governance. What it doesn't do is anchor ministerial decision-making to whether those structures are actually delivering the skills the economy needs. And Amendment 11 closes that gap. Now, that is not ideological. Colleges Scotland has been clear that colleges already deliver strong value for money and contribute directly to productivity and learner outcomes. They support this amendment precisely because it reflects what good providers already do: focus on results, not rhetoric. The same point is made in the SPICE analysis ahead of Stage 3, which highlights the importance of aligning the expanded remit of the Scottish Funding Council with economic need, not simply administrative consolidation. So this amendment is about discipline and realism. Public money should work harder. If we are serious about parity of esteem between academic and vocational pathways, then we must be serious about measuring whether funding is raising skill levels, improving completion rates and supporting progression into work, including through apprenticeships and graduate apprenticeships. Graduate apprenticeships, or I actually prefer the term degree apprenticeships because I think they're a better description of what this is. Degree apprenticeships are a good example. Where they work well, they deliver degree-level skills aligned directly to employer demand with high completion and employment rates. But uptake remains patchy and expansion has been inconsistent. And Amendment 11 gives ministers a clear statutory prompt to ask whether their funding decisions are actually scaling what works. Now, I don't think this should trouble the government. If ministers are confident that the system they are building will raise standards, boost productivity and equip Scotland's future workforce, then writing that expectation into law should be seen by them as entirely reasonable. And if I may say, the minister guiding the bill is a very reasonable fellow on a good day. So this amendment does not... That was a compliment, presiding officer. I don't know how I can reach higher on compliments than to say the minister is reasonable. This amendment doesn't tie ministers' hands. It doesn't prescribe targets. It does not privilege one route over another. It simply asks ministers to look squarely at outcomes and to fund what delivers them. That is sensible, it is sober, it is exactly the mindset we need if this bill is to be about economic growth, opportunity and raising standards, rather just a rearrangement of the system.
Thank you, and I call the Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to colleagues for explaining their amendments. These amendments that have been put forward in this group revisit proposals already brought forward at Stage 2 and which the Education Committee resisted at that juncture. Amendment 75 from Miles Briggs is similar to an amendment lodged by Willie Rennie at Stage 2 concerning an industry-led board overseeing apprenticeships. This Amendment 75 would effectively reinstate the Scottish Apprenticeships Advisory Board, otherwise known as SAB. May I first put on record the great work that SAB have done for many years, and I'm very grateful for the engagement that I've had with them since my appointment and on this bill and other matters. But the bill, as it's drafted, already establishes an apprenticeship committee within the SFC, which is expected to lead on some of the responsibilities of SAB. Recreating an additional board with overlapping responsibilities would clutter the system at a time when we are trying to simplify it. It would duplicate roles and introduce unnecessary complexity without delivering added value to the system. The bill, as amended at Stage 2, also formalises and strengthens the role of employers within the system. These changes ensure that employers continue to be central to apprenticeship delivery, but in a way that fits coherently with the new governance arrangements rather than creating parallel, unnecessary structures. Yeah, well,
On that point,
Miles Briggs.
We haven't got to Willie Rennie's amendment quite yet, but I think he's almost making the argument against it as another subcommittee structure. Is that not the case? Because I think what is important and where industry is really concerned is just to be part of a wider conversation. Their voice, their needs could be lost in translation as part of that committee, and why we think a version of SAP should be retained.
Minister.
So there are a number of amendments that we've agreed at stage 2 to make sure the voice of business and industry is even more significant within the bill, and there will be amendments that I will be urging Parliament to support later on in today's proceedings to give industry and business further voice in the process. In terms of the subcommittee, that is of course something that can be determined by SFC, and we'll come to that amendment in due course. If Miles Briggs is content, I would like to turn to Stephen Kerr's Amendment 11, which revisits one of his Stage 2 amendments. And as I set out to the committee then, this amendment is, with respect to Mr Kerr, in the view of the government, ambiguous on what constitutes measurable improvements in skills, productivity and learner achievement. The appropriate mechanism for setting expectations around funding outcomes is already available through the terms and conditions of funding, which the ministers can impose on the SFC. This is already possible under existing powers in the 2005 Act. And through Amendment 10 in Group 1, which we've just discussed, the new national funding strategy will require the Scottish ministers to set out the outcomes which the government is seeking to deliver through funding tertiary education and skills training. It's something I know that Mr Kerr has supported in our last group, and I hope will welcome. So for the reasons I've set out, I would ask Miles Briggs not to press his Amendment 75 and Stephen Kerr not to press his Amendment 11. And if they do, I would encourage colleagues to vote against them.
Thank you, Miles Briggs. To wind up, press the withdrawal Amendment 75. Mr Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I think this amendment very much goes to the heart of some of the concerns which the Education Committee has heard, and that is that industry and businesses who are desperate for apprenticeship opportunities don't feel the current systems delivering for them, but very much if their voice is not going to be specifically included, and that's where I think SAB has actually, and paid tribute, like the Minister has, to the work they have done. If that is not going to be really fundamentally at the heart of this bill, then we will lose that. Yes, happy to.
Daniel Johnson.
I'm very grateful to the member for giving way. And indeed, I think he's right to highlight and contrast the difference between SAB and the structures which are being proposed, which is fundamentally SAB is about industry representatives coming forward. I think that the concern is that the people that make up these committees and subcommittees, indeed the Council itself, will be picked by government and might not actually provide the candid insight that is really required if we're going to have a truly reflexive system and one that reflects industry views. I wonder if you would agree with that point.
Miles Briggs.
I agree, and I think one of the missed opportunities about this bill is actually to look towards the regional skills shortages we see. I was in Aberdeen on Friday and hearing about some of the specific shortages up there, some of the opportunities which certainly exist, but there's a real concern that this bill has watered down that voice, and I think we need to strengthen it, and therefore that's why I want to... yes?
Stephen Kerr.
Would my colleague Miles Briggs agree with me that it's very confusing that ministers are refusing the opportunity to take for themselves some directive powers in terms of directing what outcomes will match their aspirations for Scotland's economy in terms of issues like improvement in skills, productivity and learner achievement? Is he as confused as I am about the minister's reluctance to put outcomes onto the face of the bill?
Miles Briggs.
I think during the passage of the bill that has been a concern, and one of the aspects which I hope Parliament has actually tried to get influence over the government is actually to try to have some sort of focus yet again at stage 2 and 3 on where industry must be part of this, not an afterthought. And the Minister has moved on some of that. I don't know if he wants to intervene.
Minister.
I would just ask Miles Briggs to be slightly patient, and I think he will be uplifted on some of these points as we get to later groups in the process.
Miles Briggs.
We will wait and see, but for now I will move Amendment 75 in my name. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 75 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division, and as this is the first division of the stage, I suspend for around 5 minutes to allow members to access the digital voting system.